I'm Emma Rodriguez, 20 years old, and I've spent my entire life being the family disappointment. While my older sister Jessica earned straight A's and became the golden child, I struggled through high school with a 3.2 GPA and dreams my parents called unrealistic. Last Thanksgiving, during our traditional family dinner, my dad looked me straight in the eye and said those crushing words, "Why can't you be more like your sister? She's going places and you're just wasting your potential." The whole table went silent as tears burned my eyes. What my family didn't know was that hidden in my backpack upstairs was an acceptance letter that would change everything. 3 days later, when that letter finally came to light, my father's face went completely white. The family dynamic shifted forever, and suddenly, I wasn't the failure anymore. To understand how we got to that moment, you need to know about Jessica. My sister is 22, and from the day she could walk, she was destined for greatness, at least according to our parents. She was the child who never needed to be told. Twice to do her homework, who came home with perfect report cards that our mother would immediately post on the refrigerator, with magnetic letters spelling out, "Perfect daughter." I remember being 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table struggling with basic multiplication, while Jessica, only 9 at the time, was already helping me with problems she'd mastered years earlier. "See, Emma? It's simple," she'd say. Not unkindly, but with that patient tone that made me feel even smaller. 7 times 8 is 56. You just have to remember the pattern. But I couldn't remember the pattern. Numbers swirled in my head like alphabet soup, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make them stick. While Jessica moved effortlessly through accelerated classes, I struggled to keep up with grade-level work. Our parents chalked it up to different learning styles at first, but as the years passed and the gap widened, their patience wore thin. Jessica's room was a shrine to achievement. Ribbons from science fairs, certificates from honor roll, photos from academic award ceremonies, all carefully displayed on bulletin boards that our mother updated religiously. Her valedictorian medal from high school sat prominently on her dresser, catching the light every morning when she got ready for her classes at Northwestern University, where she was pursuing a pre-med track with a 3.9 GPA. My room, by contrast, was what our mother diplomatically called lived in. Books were scattered across every surface, not textbooks, but novels I devoured in secret. While Jessica studied organic chemistry, I lost myself in the worlds created by Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But these weren't the kinds of achievements that earned refrigerator space in the Rodriguez household. Emma reads too much fiction. I overheard my mother telling my aunt once, "It's not practical. She needs to focus on real subjects if she wants to get anywhere in life." The words stung because reading wasn't just a hobby for me, it was oxygen. In books, I found characters who struggled and overcame, who faced impossible odds, and still found ways to triumph. But try explaining that to parents who measured success solely in GPAs and standardized test scores. The comparison became a daily ritual. Jessica already knew what she wanted to major in by sophomore year. Dad would say when I expressed uncertainty about my future, Jessica never had to be reminded to study. Mom would add when she found me reading instead of working on calculus homework I couldn't understand anyway. Every conversation somehow circled back to how Jessica was excelling and how I was falling short. Looking back now, I wonder if they ever considered how those constant comparisons affected me. Did they notice how I stopped talking about my own interests? How I retreated further into books and writing because they were the only places where I felt competent? Or were they so focused on molding me into Jessica's image that they missed who I actually was? The worst part wasn't even the disappointment in their voices, it was the resignation. By my senior year of high school, they'd stopped expecting anything exceptional from me. Just graduate and maybe try community college became their refrain. The message was clear. Jessica was the one destined for greatness, and I was the consolation prize they'd learned to accept, but they had no idea what was brewing beneath the surface of their disappointing daughter my sophomore year of high. School was when everything changed, though no one in my family noticed. I was sitting in Mrs. Patterson's English class, staring at a report card that would surely disappoint my parents once again. A C+ in calculus, B in chemistry, B+ in history, respectable grades for most students, but in a household where Jessica had never earned anything below an A, my report card might as well have been written in crayon dot. Mrs. Patterson noticed me stuffing the report card deep into my backpack like it was evidence of a crime. She was young for a teacher, probably only in her 30s, with the kind of energy that made even the most reluctant students pay attention. More importantly, she was the first teacher who seemed to see something in me beyond my sister's shadow. "Emma, can you stay after class for a moment?" she asked as the bell rang. My stomach dropped. Great, I thought. Another lecture about not living up to my potential. But instead of criticism, Mrs. Patterson pulled out a folder thick with my creative writing assignments. "I've been reading your work all semester," she said, "and I have to tell you something. You have a gift." I stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. "A gift? Your essay about your grandmother's immigration story made me cry," she continued. "And your analysis of the house on Mango Street, you understood themes that graduate students struggle with. Emma, you're not struggling because you're not smart. You're struggling because you're being forced into the wrong box." That conversation planted a seed that would grow in secret over the next 2 years. Mrs. Patterson started giving me extra books to read, encouraging me to enter writing contests, and most importantly, she helped me see that intelligence comes in many forms. Jessica might have been brilliant at memorizing chemical formulas, but I could craft sentences that moved people to tears. The shift didn't happen overnight. I still brought home report cards that made my parents sigh with disappointment. I still endured dinner conversations where my academic struggles were dissected and compared unfavorably to Jessica's effortless success. But something fundamental had changed inside me. For the first time in my life, I had an adult who believed in my potential, who saw value in the very things my family dismissed as impractical. Mrs. Patterson introduced me to writing workshops and literary magazines. She helped me understand that the stories rattling around in my head weren't just escapism. They were practice for something bigger. Under her guidance, I started submitting pieces to local publications, and when I received my first acceptance letter from a regional literary magazine, I felt something I never experienced before. Pride in my own accomplishments. My parents barely glanced at the published piece when I showed them. "That's nice, honey," Mom said absently, focused on Jessica's latest organic chemistry test score, but Mrs. Patterson photocopied it and hung it on our classroom wall, right next to work from students who'd gone on to prestigious universities. By junior year, I was living a double life. At home, I was still the underachieving daughter who needed constant reminders to focus on practical subjects. But in Mrs. Patterson's classroom and the quiet corners of the library where I spent my lunch periods, I was discovering a version of myself that was capable, creative, and ambitious. I started researching colleges with strong English programs, not the community colleges my parents suggested, but real universities where writing was taken seriously as an academic discipline. I read about professors who were published authors, about literary magazines that launched careers, about alumni who'd gone on to win major awards. The more I learned, the more I realized how limited my family's vision of success really was. Yes, Jessica was brilliant, and yes, her path was impressive. But there were other ways to be intelligent, other ways to make a meaningful contribution to the world. I just needed the courage to pursue them. That courage came slowly, built through small victories and Mrs. Patterson's unwavering belief in my abilities. When I won second place in a statewide poetry contest, she was more excited than I was. When I was invited to read at a local coffee shop's open mic night, she sat in the front row, beaming with pride. These weren't the kinds of achievements that made headlines in our house, where discussions centered around Jessica's pre-med program and her impressive MCAT prep scores, but they were mine. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. By senior year, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to write, to study literature, to maybe teach someday like Mrs. Patterson. I wanted to attend a university where my passion would be nurtured rather than dismissed as impractical. The only question was whether I had the courage to pursue it without my family's support. The answer came to me gradually, through late-night sessions in the library and long conversations with Mrs. Patterson about the power of taking risks. If I waited for my family to believe in my dreams, I might wait forever. I needed to believe in them first and trust that everything else would follow. That's when I started seriously considering the impossible, applying to Yale University, where some of the most respected writers and literary scholars in the world taught and studied. It seemed like a fantasy, but Mrs. Patterson had taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is reach for something that seems just beyond your grasp. The worst thing that can happen is they say no, she told me one afternoon as we discussed my college options. But what if they say yes? What if you're exactly what they're looking for, and you just don't know it yet? Those words would echo in my head for months as I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to apply to Yale, in secret, if necessary, and prove to myself, if no one else, that the struggling student everyone saw wasn't the whole story. During my junior year, something shifted inside me. While my parents fretted over my B+ average and compared it unfavorably to Jessica's perfect GPA, I was discovering my own path. I spent every free period in the library not struggling with math homework, but devouring everything I could find about creative writing programs. Literary magazines and, yes, Ivy League schools known for their English departments, Yale kept appearing in my research, not just because of its prestige, but because of its writing community, its professors, its literary magazine that had launched countless careers. I started reading everything published by Yale alumni, studying their paths, understanding what made the university special beyond its reputation. The idea was ridiculous, of course. Emma Rodriguez, the family disappointment with her mediocre GPA, applying to Yale? My parents would have laughed if they'd known what I was thinking. Jessica was the Ivy League material in our family. I was the kid who'd probably end up at the local state school if I was lucky. But late at night, when the house was quiet and my family slept peacefully, I'd sit at my desk with college brochures hidden under my regular homework. I'd read about Yale's undergraduate writing program, about professors who'd won Pulitzer Prizes, about students who'd published novels before graduation. And slowly and possibly, I began to believe that maybe I belonged there too. I started keeping a journal, not the teenage diary kind, but something more serious. In it, I wrote about my dreams, my fears, my growing conviction that I was meant for something bigger than the small box my family had built around me. The journal became my confidant, the place where I could admit the truth I was too scared to say out loud. I wanted to be a writer, a real one, and I was willing to fight for that dream, even if I had to fight alone. Mrs. Patterson noticed the change in me before anyone else did. "You seem different lately," she observed one afternoon as I stayed after class to discuss a short story I'd written. More focused, more purposeful. "I've been thinking about what comes next," I admitted. "About college, about what I really want to study." She leaned forward, interested. "And what's that?" "Writing, literature, maybe teaching someday like you." I paused, then took a deep breath. "I've been looking at Yale." I expected her to laugh, or at least to suggest I'd be more realistic. Instead, she smiled. "Yale has an excellent English department. What draws you to it specifically?" For the next hour, we talked about my research, my growing understanding of what I wanted from a college experience. Mrs. Patterson didn't once suggest that my dreams were too big or unrealistic. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about my goals and encouraged me to think seriously about what it would take to get there. "You know," she said as our conversation wound down, "I went to an Ivy League school for my master's degree, Columbia. Before that, I was just a small-town girl who loved books and had teachers who believed in me. Sometimes the biggest barrier to achieving something isn't your ability, it's your willingness to believe you deserve it." That conversation was a turning point. If Mrs. Patterson, someone I respected immensely, thought I had potential, maybe I needed to start taking myself more seriously. Maybe the voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough was wrong. I started planning in earnest. I researched Yale's application requirements, studied their supplemental essay prompts, and began crafting responses that would showcase not just my academic abilities, but my unique perspective. I read interviews with admissions officers trying to understand what they were really looking for beyond test scores and GPAs. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that I had something valuable to offer. My GPA might not have been perfect, but my writing was strong, my perspective was unique, and my passion for literature was genuine. I wasn't trying to get into Yale because it was prestigious. I was drawn there because it felt like home for the person I was becoming, but keeping the dream secret was harder than I'd anticipated. Every family dinner where my parents discussed Jessica's latest academic triumph was a reminder that I was pursuing something they'd never understand. Every conversation about my lack of direction made me want to scream that I knew exactly where I was going. I just couldn't tell them yet. The isolation was difficult, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what others expected of me. I was writing my own story literally and figuratively, and that felt revolutionary. By the end of junior year, I'd made my decision. I was going to apply to Yale Early Action, and I was going to do it without telling my family. If I got rejected, I'd deal with the disappointment privately and apply to more realistic options. But if I got accepted, well, that would be a conversation worth having. The summer before senior year, I worked extra shifts at the bookstore to save money for application fees. I used my employee discount to buy SAT prep books and spent my breaks studying in the back room. Every dollar I earned and every hour I studied felt like an investment in a future my family couldn't see, but I was determined to create. Looking back, I realized that keeping my Yale dream secret was about more than just avoiding ridicule. It was about protecting something precious and fragile, my belief in my own potential. In a family where I'd always been the disappointment, I needed space to discover who I really was without the weight of their low expectations. That journal, it sort of became my lifeline, filled with college research, essay drafts, and midnight confessions about my hopes and fears. In its pages, I wasn't the struggling student or the disappointing daughter. I was Emma Rodriguez, future Yale student, and for the first time in my life, that identity felt real and achievable. The secret was growing inside me like a small flame, warming me through the cold reality of family dinners where I was still. The cautionary tale. Soon, I knew it would be time to let that flame become a fire that would light up everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world. The application process became my secret mission. While my parents assumed I was finally taking academics seriously, I was crafting the most important piece of writing I'd ever attempted, my personal essay. I wrote about growing up in the shadow of perfection, about finding my voice through literature, about the power of stories to transform lives. Mrs. Patterson helped me revise draft after draft, never once suggesting that my dreams were too big. Don't make yourself smaller to fit other people's expectations, she told me one afternoon as we worked on my essay together. Yale needs students who think differently, who bring unique perspectives. That's exactly what you offer. The essay went through 17 drafts before I was satisfied. Each version dug deeper into my story, revealing layers I hadn't even known existed. I wrote about the pain of constant comparison, but also about the strength I'd found in books and writing. I described my grandmother's immigration story and how it had taught me that courage sometimes means pursuing dreams that others can't understand. The most challenging part was the supplemental essays. Yale wanted to know what I contribute to, their community, what made me unique, why I was drawn to their specific programs. These weren't questions I could answer with test scores or grades. They required me to articulate something deeper about who I was and who I wanted to become. I spent weeks researching Yale's literary magazine. The Yale Literary Magazine, the oldest undergraduate literary publication in the United States. I read issues from recent years, studied the kinds of work they published, and began to envision myself as part of that tradition. In my supplemental essay, I wrote about wanting to contribute to a community where literature wasn't just studied, but lived, where young writers could find their voices alongside established masters. The letter of recommendation from Mrs. Patterson was something I hadn't expected. She'd approached me in late September, saying she'd like to write on my behalf for whatever colleges I was considering. When I finally worked up the courage to tell her about Yale, she didn't even blink. "I've been hoping you'd aim high," she said simply. "You deserve to be at a place that will challenge and nurture your talents." Later, I learned that her letter described me as one of the most naturally gifted writers I've encountered in 15 years of teaching, and detailed how I'd overcome academic struggles to find my true calling. She wrote about my unique perspective, my dedication to craft, and my potential to contribute meaningfully to a university community. It was the kind of recommendation that could change a life, and she'd written it for me. The hardest part was taking the SAT again. My first score had been decent, but not Yale-level impressive. Once spent the summer studying, using every free moment at the bookstore to work through practice problems. Mrs. Patterson let me use her classroom after school for quiet study sessions, and slowly, my scores improved. When I retook the test in October, I felt more prepared than ever before. The reading and writing sections felt like conversations with old friends. I'd been analyzing literature and crafting arguments for years, even if my family hadn't recognized it as valuable preparation. My math score was still my weakness, but my verbal scores were strong enough to put me in the running. I applied online late one night in November. Using the computer in the public library after it closed, Mrs. Patterson had given me the after-hours code. As I clicked submit and paid the application fee with money I'd saved from months of extra shifts, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I'd done it. I'd actually applied to Yale University. The waiting began immediately. I checked my email obsessively, even though I knew the decision wouldn't come until December. Every day at school felt surreal. I was going through the motions of senior year while carrying this enormous secret about my future. My parents noticed that I seemed more focused, more driven, but they attributed it to finally getting serious. About my education? Maybe Emma's finally growing up, I heard my mother tell Jessica over the phone. If only she knew that her finally grown-up daughter had been mature enough to pursue her dreams, independently for months. The stress of keeping. The secret was almost unbearable at times. During family dinners where college came up, I had to bite my tongue to keep from mentioning my application. When my parents suggested community college brochures, I nodded politely while thinking about Yale's Gothic architecture and world-renowned. Faculty.Jessica was home for Thanksgiving break when the emotional weight of the secret nearly broke me. She found me crying in my room one evening, overwhelmed by the pressure of waiting and the isolation of having no one to share my fears with. "Emma, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting on my bed with genuine concern. I almost told her everything then. The words were right there, desperate to spill out. But something held me back, maybe the fear that even Jessica, who'd always been supportive in her own way, wouldn't understand why I kept such a big decision secret from the family. "Just senior year stress," I said instead. Figuring out what comes next, she nodded sympathetically. "It's hard when you feel like everyone expects you to have all the answers. But you'll figure it out, Em. You're stronger than you think." If she only knew how strong I already had to be. The Yale interview came in early December. I requested it, knowing it might be my chance to show parts of myself that couldn't come through on paper. The interviewer was a local alumnus, a lawyer, who'd graduated 15 years earlier and still spoke about Yale with obvious affection. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and I was terrified I'd say something wrong, that he'd see through me to the struggling student my family knew and find me lacking. But something magical happened during that conversation. When he asked about my interests, I found myself speaking passionately about literature, about the ways stories could bridge divides and help people understand each other. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said as our hour together wound down. I wasn't the obvious Yale candidate either. My grades were good but not perfect, and I came from a family that didn't really understand why I wanted to study English literature. But Yale taught me that academic excellence comes in many forms, and passion often matters more than perfection. As I walked home from that interview, I felt something I'd rarely experienced, confidence in my own worth. Whatever happened with my application, I presented my authentic self to someone who understood what Yale was really looking for. I'd proven to myself that I belonged in conversations about literature and ideas, that my perspective had value. The decision email would. Come any day now, and I was as ready as I'd ever be to learn whether Yale agreed. December felt like the longest month of my life. Every morning I'd check my email before even getting out of bed, my heart racing as I scrolled through messages from clothing stores and social media notifications, hoping to find the one email that would change everything. Yale's early action decisions were supposed to come out by December 15th, and each day that passed felt like an eternity. The calendar on my desk became my enemy and my obsession. I'd mark the potential decision, date with a red circle, and every morning I'd cross off another day, counting down to what felt like Judgment Day. The anticipation was affecting everything: my sleep, my appetite, my ability to focus on anything else at school. I was going through the motions of senior year while my mind was entirely elsewhere. My classmates were comparing notes about their college applications, most of them talking about state schools and local universities. When they asked about my plans, I'd mumble something vague about still figuring it out, which wasn't technically a lie, but felt like a betrayal of the huge risk I'd taken. The hardest part was watching Jessica come home for winter break, glowing, with stories about her success at Northwestern. During dinner, she'd talk about her organic chemistry lab, her research opportunity with a professor, her impressive GPA that would certainly get her into medical school. My parents hung on every word, asking detailed questions and beaming with pride. "And what about you, Emma?" Jessica would ask kindly, trying to include me in the conversation. "How are things going with your senior year?" "Fine," I'd answer, pushing food around my plate. "Just trying to keep my grades up." What I wanted to say was, I applied to Yale University, and I might find out any day whether I've been accepted to one of the most prestigious schools in the world. But the words stayed blocked inside me, too precious and too terrifying to speak. Aloud, the internal struggle was exhausting. Part of me desperately wanted to share the secret, to have someone to talk through my anxiety with. But another part of me was terrified of jinxing it, of having to face my family's reaction if I got rejected. At least this way, if Yale said no, I could process the disappointment privately before figuring out my next steps. Mrs. Patterson could see the stress written all over my face. "How are you holding up?" she asked one afternoon as I stayed after class, ostensibly to work on a poetry assignment, but really just to have someone to sit with who knew what I was going through. "I keep checking my email every 5 minutes, I admitted. "I can't concentrate on anything else." "That's completely normal," she assured me. Waiting for something this important is one of the hardest things anyone can do. But remember, whatever happens, you've already accomplished something remarkable just by applying. You've proven to yourself that you're brave enough to reach for what you want. Her words helped, but they couldn't eliminate the anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my mind immediately jumping to thoughts of the decision email. During family dinners, I'd feel like I was living a double life, nodding along to conversations about my uncertain future while secretly knowing that clarity might be just days away. The worst moments came when my parents would make offhand comments about my lack of direction. "We should probably start looking at community college applications as a backup," Mom said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "Just in case Emma doesn't figure out what she wants to do." I wanted to scream that I knew exactly what I wanted to do, that I'd known for months, that I'd been working toward it with more determination than they'd ever given me credit for. Instead, I nodded and agreed that backup plans were important, all while thinking about the Yale application that represented everything I was fighting for. December 10th came and went with no email. Then the 12th. The 15th, the date they'd originally indicated, passed without word. By December 18th, I was checking my emails so frequently that I'd worn a path in the carpet of my bedroom from pacing between my desk and my bed. Finally, on December 20th, I saw an email from Yale University in my inbox. My heart stopped. This was it. After months of secret planning, weeks of waiting, and years of feeling like the family disappointment, I was about to learn whether my impossible dream had any chance of becoming reality. I stared at the email for a full minute before opening it, terrified of what it might say. In that moment before I clicked, I was still the girl who might get into Yale. Once I opened it, I'd either be the girl who did or the girl who didn't, and there was no going back. Taking a deep breath, I opened the email. The first word I saw was congratulations. I read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. Yale University was offering me admission. Not just acceptance, they were excited to have me join their community. They specifically mentioned my personal essay and how my unique perspective would contribute to campus diversity. I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. Emma Rodriguez, the struggling student, the family disappointment, the girl who couldn't even handle calculus. I was going to Yale University. The elation was overwhelming, but so was the fear. How would I tell my family? How would I explain that I've been hiding this from them for months? How would they react to discovering that their directionless daughter had been working towards something extraordinary all along? For now, the secret was still mine to keep. But I knew that soon, very soon, everything was going to change. I was working at the bookstore when it happened. It was a Tuesday in late March, and I was shelving returns in the poetry section when my phone buzzed with an email notification. My heart stopped when I saw the sender, Yale University Office of Undergraduate Admissions. My hands shook as I opened the email. The first word I saw was congratulations. I must have made a sound because Mrs. Henderson, the store owner, came rushing over. Emma, are you all right? I couldn't speak. I just handed her my phone and her face lit up as she read the message. Oh my goodness, Yale University. Emma, this is incredible. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I kept reading the email, making sure it was real, that they hadn't made a mistake. Emma Rodriguez, the family disappointment, had been accepted to one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The email was more than just an acceptance. It was a validation of everything I believed about myself during those long months of secret planning. They mentioned my personal essay specifically, noting how my unique perspective on overcoming adversity through literature would contribute to their incoming class. They were excited to welcome me to the Yale community. But even in my joy, I felt a strange kind of sadness. This should have been a moment to share with my family, to call my parents screaming with excitement. Instead, I found myself planning how to keep it secret just a little longer, because I knew that telling them would require explaining how I'd applied without their knowledge, how I'd been planning this for 2 years while they assumed I had no direction in life. When I got home that evening, my family was gathered around the dinner table as usual. Jessica was visiting for spring break, updating everyone on her medical school applications and research opportunities. My parents hung on every word, asking detailed questions about her CAT scores and interviewing process. What about you, Emma? Jessica asked, turning to me with that patient smile I'd grown up with. Any thoughts about college applications? The deadlines are coming up soon. The irony was almost too much to bear. Still thinking about it, I said, cutting my chicken into small pieces to avoid making eye contact. There's time. Well, don't wait too long, Dad warned. Even community colleges fill up if you wait until the last minute. I nodded and made appropriate sounds of agreement, all while thinking about the acceptance letter that was burning a hole in my email inbox. Part of me wanted to jump up from the table and announce my news, to see the shock and amazement on their faces. But another part of me, the part that had learned to protect my dreams from their low expectations, wasn't ready to share yet. That night, I printed out the acceptance letter and held it in my hands for the first time. Seeing it on paper made it feel more real, more permanent. This wasn't just a digital file that could disappear. This was tangible proof that I was more than my family had ever imagined. I called Mrs. Patterson the next morning before school, unable to contain my excitement any longer. Emma, she practically shouted when I told her the news. I knew it. I absolutely knew they'd see what I see in you. This is extraordinary. Her excitement was infectious and healing. After months of carrying this secret alone, having someone celebrate with me felt like coming up for air. She wanted to know every detail about the acceptance letter, about my feelings, about my plans. When are you going to tell your family? She asked. I'm not sure, I admitted. I think I want to wait a little longer. Maybe until I have to make a decision about enrollment. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. Emma, I understand wanting to savor this moment, but they're going to find out eventually. Don't you think they deserve to know? And don't you think you deserve to have them celebrate with you? She was right, of course. But the fear was still. Their fear of their reaction to my secrecy, fear of having to defend my choices, fear of them somehow diminishing this achievement with their surprise and questions. Over the next few weeks, keeping the secret became harder and harder. Every conversation about my future felt like a lie. When my parents suggested I apply to the local state university just to have options, I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying I already had the best option possible, the physical acceptance. Letter arrived in early April, thick and official with the Yale seal embossed on the envelope. I intercepted it before anyone else could see it, hiding it in my room like contraband. Sometimes I'd take it out just to look at it, to remind myself that it was real. Jessica was the one who almost discovered my secret. She was helping me organize my room one afternoon when she noticed my behavior change around my desk. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to a corner of paper sticking out from under some textbooks. "Nothing important," I said quickly, sliding the Yale packet completely out of sight. "Just some college brochures." She looked at me curiously, but didn't push. And if you're thinking about college, I'm happy to help you with applications. I know it can feel overwhelming. The offer was so kind and so genuine that I almost broke down and told her everything right then, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride. I wanted to prove I could do this on my own. Maybe it was self-protection. I needed to know I could succeed without anyone's help before I let them in. "Thanks," I said instead. "I'm still figuring things out." As spring turned towards summer and graduation approached, I knew I couldn't keep this secret much longer. Yale would need a response to their offer, and I'd need to start making practical plans for the fall. But I decided when and how to reveal my acceptance. It would be at Thanksgiving, in front of the whole family, when I could finally show them who I really was. I had no idea how explosive that revelation would be, or how much it would change everything I thought I knew about my place in our family. For now, the secret was still mine, and I was still the girl who'd proven to herself that impossible dreams sometimes do come true. The months between my acceptance and Thanksgiving were strange ones. I walked through my daily life carrying this enormous secret like a superhero with a hidden identity. At family dinners, when my parents made their usual comments about my lack of direction, I would nod and agree while thinking about my Yale acceptance letter safely hidden in my desk drawer. Jessica was home more frequently as she finished her junior year at Northwestern, and I found myself studying her interactions with our parents with new eyes. I noticed how she tensed when Dad praised her latest organic chemistry grade, how she deflected when Mom talked to neighbors about her brilliant pre-med daughter. For the first time, I wondered if being the golden child was as easy as I'd always assumed. Out one evening in October, Jessica found me in the backyard reading. It was unusual for her to seek me out. Our relationship had always been cordial but distant, shaped by the competitive dynamic our parents had created. "What are you reading?" she asked, settling into the chair next to mine. I showed her the cover, On Writing by Stephen King. "It's about the craft of writing, how to develop your voice as an author." She nodded thoughtfully. "You've always been a good writer. I remember your high school graduation speech. It was beautiful." The comment surprised me. Our parents had barely acknowledged that speech, too disappointed by my class rank to appreciate the words I crafted so carefully. "Thanks," I said. "Sometimes I think about what it would be like to study writing seriously, like in a real program at a good school." Jessica was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. "You should do it. You shouldn't let anyone talk you out of pursuing what you love." There was something in her tone, a weariness that I'd never heard before. "Jess, are you okay?" She sighed. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you're so busy being what everyone expects that you forget who you actually are?" I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. The perfect daughter. The family pride suddenly looked very young and very tired. "Every day," I admitted. We sat in comfortable silence after that. Two sisters who'd been pitted against each other finally finding common ground. I almost told her about Yale that night, but something held me back. The secret still felt too precious, too fragile to share it out as Thanksgiving approached. I rehearsed the revelation in my head countless times. I imagined my parents' faces, their shock, their apologies for underestimating me. In my fantasies, the moment was triumphant and healing, bringing our family closer together through the recognition of my achievements. The planning became obsessive. I decided I'd wait until after the traditional round of family updates, when everyone had shared their news, and the conversation inevitably turned to future plans. That's when I'd stand up and make my announcement, producing the acceptance letter, like a magician revealing the secret behind an impossible trick. Practice the words in front of my mirror. I have something to tell you all. I've been accepted to Yale University. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. I imagined the silence that would follow, the gradual dawning of realization on their faces. But as the date grew closer, my confidence began to waver. What if they were angry about the secrecy? What if they questioned whether I was really capable of succeeding at such a prestigious school? What if this moment I'd been building up in my mind for months turned out to be a disaster? The night before Thanksgiving, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, directionless, constantly compared to Jessica, resigned to her family's low expectations. Tomorrow, I'd reveal that girl was gone, replaced by someone who'd had the courage to bet on herself when no one else would. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. About the countless hours I'd spent crafting my application, the interviews and essays and moments of doubt I'd pushed through alone. About the acceptance letter hidden in my desk drawer, waiting for its moment to change everything. Whatever happened tomorrow, I already won the most important victory. I'd proven to myself that I was more than anyone had imagined, including me. The rest was just sharing that truth with the people I loved, and hoping they'd be ready to see me clearly for the first time. But I had no idea how dramatically that revelation would reshape not just how my family saw me, but how I understood my place in the world. The morning of Thanksgiving, our house buzzed with the familiar chaos of holiday preparation. Mom had been cooking since dawn, filling the kitchen with the scents of turkey, stuffing, and her famous sweet potato casserole. Dad was in the living room, setting up extra chairs and arguing with the TV remote while trying to find the football game. I helped where I could, but my mind was elsewhere. The Yale acceptance letter was folded carefully in my pocket, and every few minutes I'd touch it to make sure it was still there. Today was the day I'd finally tell them the truth about who I really was. Jessica arrived around noon with her boyfriend Marcus, a fellow Northwestern student who was studying engineering. Our parents loved him. He was smart, ambitious, and most importantly, he worshipped Jessica in a way that reinforced their view of her as exceptional. Emma, Jessica hugged me tightly. You look different, happy. I feel different, I admitted, though I couldn't tell her why yet. The extended family began arriving in the early afternoon. Uncle Roberto and Aunt Maria with their twin boys, Grandma, Elena, who still insisted on bringing her own flan despite Mom's protests, and various cousins and family friends who'd become part of our Thanksgiving tradition over the years. As always, the conversation centered around achievements and updates. Uncle Roberto bragged about his promotion at the accounting firm. The twins showed off their latest soccer trophies, and inevitably, all eyes turned to Jessica for her updates from Northwestern. She's applying to medical schools next year, Mom announced proudly before Jessica could even speak. Her MCAT scores were incredible, 95th percentile. That's wonderful. Grandma Elena beamed. And what about Emma? How is school going for you, Mia? The question I'd been dreading and anticipating all day. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over the table. This was usually the moment when the conversation would quickly pivot away from me and back to more successful family members. Emma's taking some time to figure things out, Dad answered for me, his tone carrying just enough resignation to make it clear that figuring things out was code for not accomplishing anything worthwhile. She's working at that bookstore. Mom added, it's good for her to learn responsibility. The condescension in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Around the table, I could see the sympathetic looks from relatives who'd watched me struggle through school while Jessica excelled. Poor Emma, they were thinking. Still trying to find her way. My face burned with embarrassment and anger. Even on Thanksgiving, surrounded by family, I was still the cautionary tale, the example of unfulfilled potential. The contrast with Jessica's glowing introduction was stark and intentional. At least she's working, Aunt Maria said kindly, trying to soften the moment. That's more than a lot of kids her age can say. True, Dad agreed. We just hope she figure out what she wants to do with her life soon. She can't work retail forever. The words hit me like a physical blow. They were talking about me like I wasn't even there, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person with dreams and ambitions. The Yale acceptance letter in my pocket felt like it was burning against my leg. Maybe she could take some classes at the community college, Uncle Roberto suggested. Get our feet wet with higher education. We've suggested that, Mom replied with a sigh. But Emma's always been resistant to traditional education. She's more of a, she paused, searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it, creative type. The way she said creative type made it sound like a medical condition rather than a legitimate way of thinking about the world. I looked around the table at my family people who claimed to love me but clearly had no idea who I actually was. Speaking of education, Dad said, turning back to Jessica, tell everyone about your research project. And just like that, I was dismissed. The conversation moved on to Jessica's internship at a prestigious medical research facility, her upcoming medical school interviews, her bright and certain future. I sat there picking at my turkey, feeling smaller with every word of praise directed. And my sister Dot, the breaking point came during dessert. We were all gathered around the table, full and comfortable, sharing stories and family memories. Dad was telling Uncle Roberto about Jessica's latest academic achievement when he turned to me with what I'm sure he thought was a helpful suggestion. You know, Emma, he said, his voice carrying that patient tone parents use when they're about to deliver wisdom they think you need to hear. Maybe you should think about following Jessica's example a little more. She's always known what she wanted, always been focused. The table went quiet. Even the twins looked up from their phones. I mean, Dad continued, apparently not noticing. The sudden tension, Jessica has direction. She has goals. She's going places. He looked directly at me, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes that he'd been carrying for years. Why can't you be more like your sister? She's accomplished so much, and you're just... He gestured vaguely at me. You're wasting your potential. The silence that followed was deafening. Forks paused midway to mouth. Uncle Roberto's wine glass stopped moving toward his lips. Even Marcus, usually absorbed in his phone, looked up with obvious discomfort. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I was too shocked to cry. 20 years of being the disappointment had culminated in this moment, my father asking, in front of our entire extended family, why I couldn't be more like the sister who'd always overshadowed me. David? Mom said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with how public he'd made his criticism. What? Dad said defensively. I'm just saying she needs to get serious about her future. Look at Jessica, she's got everything figured out. Medical school, career path, the whole thing. Emma's 20 years old and still acting like she has all the time in the world to figure things out. Jessica was staring at her plate, her face red with embarrassment. Dad, maybe this isn't... No, it's fine, I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since the conversation started. My hand moved to the letter in my pocket, and suddenly I knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not the gentle revelation I planned, but something more dramatic, more necessary. Actually, I said, standing up from my chair so everyone could see me clearly, I have something to tell you all. The table quieted completely, probably expecting me to apologize for being such a disappointment or promise to do better in my future. I've been accepted to Yale University. The silence that followed was even more complete than before. You could have heard a pin drop in that dining room. I watched as the words sank in, as the impossible became real in their minds. Dad was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma, this isn't the time for jokes. I'm not joking. I pulled the acceptance letter from my pocket, unfolding it carefully. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I applied early action and was accepted in December. I start next fall. Mom reached for the letter with trembling hands. Her lips moved silently as she read, and her face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, something that looked like recognition. This is real, she whispered. This is actually real. Dad took the letter next, reading it twice before looking up at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The man who had just asked why I couldn't be more like my sister was staring at. Proof that I'd already surpassed every expectation anyone had ever had for me. Emma, I don't understand, he said, his voice small and confused. When did you apply? Why didn't you tell us? The question I'd been preparing for. I looked around the table at all these people I loved, who had spent years underestimating me, and felt a surge of something I'd never experienced before. The power that comes from proving people wrong. Because I knew you wouldn't believe I could get in, I said quietly. Because every time I mentioned college, you redirected the conversation to community college or trade school. Because I got tired of being told my dreams were unrealistic. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose they were. The aftermath of my announcement was chaos. Grandma Elena was the first to react with pure joy, standing up and pulling me into a fierce hug while speaking rapid Spanish that roughly translated to pride and amazement. My granddaughter at Yale, Dios mío, Uncle Roberto, started asking practical questions about when I'd applied and what I wanted to study. The twins actually put down their phones, suddenly interested in their cousin who'd gone from family disappointment to Yale, student in the span of 30 seconds. But I was watching my parents, seeing them struggle to reconcile this news with 20 years of assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. Dad kept looking between me and the acceptance letter as if he couldn't quite believe they belonged to the same person. But your grades, Mom started, then stopped herself, realizing how that sounded. We're good enough for Yale, apparently, I said quietly, along with my personal essay, my letters of recommendation, and my portfolio of creative writing. Turns out there's more than one way to be smart. The comment was pointed, and everyone knew it. For years, my family had defined intelligence solely through Jessica's achievements test scores, GPAs, science competitions. They'd never considered that my love of reading and writing might be its own form of academic excellence. Jessica caught my eye from across the table and smiled, not the polite smile she usually wore at family gatherings, but something genuine and proud. Later, she would tell me that watching me stand up for myself that day was one of the most inspiring things she'd ever witnessed. Marcus, who barely knew me but had heard plenty about the struggling sister, looked genuinely impressed. Yale's English department is incredible, he said. You must be an amazing writer. It was the first time anyone in my family had ever called me amazing at anything. The conversation continued around me, but I felt oddly detached from it all. I'd been planning this moment for months, but now that it was happening, it felt surreal. The girl who'd been dismissed as directionless just minutes earlier was suddenly the center of attention, fielding questions about her prestigious university and her plans for the future. But underneath the congratulations and excitement, I could sense the tension. My parents were struggling with more than just surprise. They were grappling with guilt. Every dismissive comment they'd made about my potential, every comparison to Jessica, every suggestion that I lower my expectations was being recontextualized in light of this new information. How long have you been planning this? Dad asked finally, his voice careful and controlled. Since junior year, I admitted. Mrs. Patterson helped me with my application. She wrote one of my recommendation letters. Mrs. Patterson knew before. We did? Mom's voice carried a note of hurt that I confided in my teacher instead of my family. She believed in me when no one else would, I said simply. She saw something in my writing that made her think I could succeed at a place like Yale. The words were gentle, but their implication was clear. My teacher had seen potential that my own parents had missed. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, filled with the weight of years of missed opportunities for understanding and support. Aunt Maria tried to lighten the mood. Well, this is certainly the most exciting Thanksgiving news we've had in years. Tell us about Yale, Mia. What will you study? For the next hour, I found myself in the strange position of being the family success story. People who had barely paid attention to me before suddenly wanted to know everything about my plans, my interests, my future goals. It was gratifying, but also surreal. Where had this interest been when I was struggling to find my voice? As the evening wound down and relatives began to leave, the congratulations continued. "We're so proud of you," Grandma Elena whispered as she hugged me goodbye. "Your great-grandmother would be amazed to know her descendant was going to Yale University." Uncle Roberto clapped me on the shoulder. "You really surprised us all, Emma, in the best possible way." But it was the conversation with my parents after everyone left that I was dreading most. We stood in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of dinner, the three of us moving around each other carefully like we were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Finally, Dad broke the silence. "Emma, I owe you an apology. A big one." I looked up from the dishes I was washing, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes for the first time. "All those times I said you needed to be more like Jessica, I was wrong. You didn't need to be more like anyone else. You needed us to see who you already were." It wasn't enough to erase 20 years of feeling like a disappointment, but it was a start. Mom nodded in agreement, tears in her eyes. "I keep thinking about all the times I told you to. Be more practical," she said softly. "All the times I dismissed your writing as a hobby instead of recognizing it as a gift. I was trying to protect you from disappointment, but I was the one disappointing you." Standing there in our kitchen, surrounded by the aftermath of the most important conversation of my life, I felt something shift in our family dynamic. The roles we'd all been playing for so long, Jessica the achiever, Emma the disappointment, parents the disappointed, were cracking apart, making room for something more honest and complex. "I forgive you," I said finally. "But I need you to understand that this is who I've always been." Yale didn't make me smart or capable, they just recognized what was already there. As I headed to my room that night, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day, I realized that revealing my acceptance had been just the beginning. Now came the harder work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and low expectations. But for the first time in my life, I felt like my family was seeing me clearly. And that was worth everything I'd gone through to get here. Later that evening, as the house finally quieted down after the chaos of Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself sitting on my bed staring at the Yale acceptance letter. The paper was wrinkled now from being folded and unfolded so many times. The words were still there. "Congratulations. Pleased to offer you admission. Excited to welcome you to our community." A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "Emma, can I come in?" Jessica's voice was gentle, different from the confident tone she usually carried. I folded the letter carefully and set it on my nightstand. "Sure," I called out. She entered quietly, closing the door behind her. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two sisters who had spent so many years on opposite sides of our parents' expectations, finally in uncharted territory. "That was incredible," she said finally, settling cross-legged on my bed like we were kids again. "I mean, Yale? Emma, do you realize what you've accomplished?" I studied her face, looking for any sign of the resentment or jealousy I'd half expected. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely seen from Jessica: genuine admiration. "Are you okay with it?" I asked carefully. "I know this changes things. I'm not the family failure anymore." Jessica was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Emma, can I tell you something? I've been jealous of you for years." I stared at her. "Jealous of me? Jess, you're perfect. You've always been perfect." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Perfect at what? Following a script that someone else wrote for me? Do you know how exhausting it is to be the golden child? To have everyone's expectations resting on your shoulders all the time? I never thought about it that way. Jessica had always seemed so confident, so sure of her path. Every grade, every test, every decision I make, it all gets scrutinized because I'm supposed to be the successful one, she continued. Do you know how many times I've wanted to change my major, but couldn't because everyone expects me to be a doctor? Do you know how many nights I've lain awake wondering if I even like medicine or if I just like making mom and dad proud? The vulnerability in her voice was something I'd never heard before. This was Jessica without her armor of achievement, and she looked surprisingly fragile. But you're so good at it, I said weakly. Your grades, your research. I'm good at memorizing information and regurgitating it on tests, she corrected. That's not the same as being passionate about something. You, she pointed at me, you've always known who you are. Even when Mom and Dad were trying to make you into something else, you kept reading, kept writing, kept being true to yourself. I envied that courage. I felt tears stinging my eyes. I didn't feel courageous. I felt like a disappointment. Maybe, Jessica said gently, but you never let that stop you from pursuing what you loved. You applied to Yale in secret because you believed in yourself when no one else would. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. We sat in silence for a while, processing the shift in our relationship. For 20 years, we've been cast as opposite characters in our family story, the achiever and the disappointment, the golden child and the problem. But that narrative was dissolving, revealing two young women who had more in common than either of us had realized. Can I see it again? Jessica asked softly. The letter? I handed it to her and she read it slowly, carefully, like she was trying to memorize every word. They mention your personal essay specifically, she noted. What did you write about? Growing. Up in your shadow, I admitted. About learning to find my own worth when everyone around me was comparing me to someone else. Jessica winced. I'm sorry, Em. I never wanted to be the standard you were measured against. I never asked for that role. I know, I said quickly. It wasn't your fault. It was just the way things were. Well, things are different now, she said firmly. You're going to Yale University. Do you understand how huge that is? Do you understand that you've just proven that there are multiple ways to be successful, multiple ways to be smart? She handed the letter back to me, and her smile was the first one I'd ever seen from her that was completely free of the pressure to be perfect. I have something to tell you too, she said quietly. I've been thinking about changing my major. I looked up surprised. To what? Art therapy? I've been taking some psychology electives, and I love them. I want to help people, but not necessarily as a doctor. The thing is, she paused, looking uncertain in a way I'd rarely seen. I don't think I ever really wanted to be a doctor. I think I wanted to make Mom and Dad proud, and being pre-med seemed like the surest way to do that. Jess, that's huge. What made you realize this? She smiled ruefully. Watching you apply to Yale in secret, actually. It made me think about how brave you were to pursue what you really wanted, even when everyone around you was saying you should want something else. I realized I've never been that brave. We talked until almost 3 a.m. that night, really talked for the first time since we were children. She told me about the pressure she'd felt to be perfect, how exhausting it was to carry everyone's expectations. I told her about years of feeling invisible, about finding myself through writing when nothing else made sense. You know what's funny? Jessica said as we finally said goodnight. I always envied how you seemed so sure of who you were. Even when Mom and Dad were criticizing you for reading too much or not focusing on practical subjects, you never stopped being yourself. I've spent so many years being who everyone else wanted me to be that I'm not sure I remember who I actually am. You'll figure it out, I told her. And when you do, I'll be cheering you on. As she headed back to her room, Jessica paused at my door. Emma, I'm really proud of you. Not just for getting into Yale, but for having the courage to believe in yourself when no one else would. You've inspired me to be braver too. After she left, I sat alone with my thoughts and my acceptance letter. The girl who had revealed her Yale admission a few hours earlier was already gone, replaced by someone who understood that success comes in many forms. and that the most important victory is learning to see yourself clearly. My relationship with Jessica would never be the same. It would be better, built on mutual respect instead of comparison. And that felt like an even greater achievement than getting into Yale University. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. Word of my Yale acceptance spread through our small community like wildfire. And suddenly I was the subject of conversations that had nothing to do with being compared to Jessica. Mrs. Patterson cried when I told her the news the Monday after Thanksgiving, and even gave me a letter she'd written to the Yale admissions committee, a letter I'd never known existed, describing my potential in terms my own parents had never used. I wrote this back in November, she explained, handing me a copy. I wanted them to understand not just what kind of student you are, but what kind of person you are. Someone who perseveres despite obstacles, who finds beauty and meaning in literature, who has the rare gift of seeing the world through a writer's eyes. Reading her words, I understood for the first time how much support I'd had. Even when I felt completely alone, Mrs. Patterson hadn't just believed in me. She'd advocated for me, fought for me in ways I'd never even known about. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about the local girl makes good angle, which felt surreal after years of invisibility. Standing in front of the bookstore for photos, holding my acceptance letter, I felt like I was inhabiting someone else's life, but in the best possible way. At home, the dynamics were shifting in ways both subtle and profound. My parents, clearly struggling with guilt over their years of low expectations, began overcompensating with praise and attention that felt awkward after so long being overlooked. Mom started asking about my writing, actually reading pieces I shared with her instead of dismissing them as impractical. Dad began talking about Yale with pride, though I could see him mentally recalculating 20 years of assumptions about my intelligence and potential. But it was my planning sessions with Jessica that became the most meaningful part of those weeks. She had become my unexpected ally, helping me navigate the practical aspects of preparing for Yale, while also serving as a bridge between me and our parents. "You need to start thinking about what you want to study," she said one evening as we sat in a room surrounded by Yale course catalogs and brochures. "I know you love writing, but Yale has so many options within their English department." We spent hours going through the academic requirements, mapping out potential course sequences, discussing professors whose work I'd already read and admired. Jessica's methodical approach to planning, which had always seemed so foreign to me, now felt helpful rather than intimidating. "Have you thought about study abroad?" she asked, pointing to a program description. "Look, they have a writing program in Dublin. You could study Irish literature in Ireland." The possibility was intoxicating. 6 months earlier, I'd been resigned to community college. Now I was planning international academic experiences at one of the world's most prestigious universities. "There's something else we need to talk about," Jessica said, setting down the catalog. "How are you going to handle the financial side of this?" It was a question I'd been avoiding. Yale was expensive, more expensive than anything my family had ever contemplated for my education. When my parents had discussed college for me, it was always in terms of affordable state schools or community college. The idea that I might need significant financial aid had never been part of their planning. "I've been looking into financial aid," I admitted. "Yale has need-based assistance, and they meet full demonstrated need for admitted students." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "That's good. But you should also look into outside scholarships. There are tons of them for students like you. First-generation college students, aspiring writers, students who've overcome obstacles." "I'm not first generation," I pointed out. "You're already in college." "But you're the first in our family to attend an Ivy League school," she said. "And you're certainly the first to pursue creative writing seriously. There might be scholarships specifically for that." Over the next few weeks, Jessica helped me navigate the world of scholarship applications, financial aid forms, and practical preparation that I'd never had to think about before. Her experience at Northwestern had taught her about resources and opportunities that I would have missed entirely. The thing about elite universities, she explained one afternoon as we worked on yet another scholarship essay, is that they want to help you succeed. They don't just admit you and leave you to figure everything out on your own. Yale has writing centers, tutoring programs, mentorship opportunities. You just need to take advantage of them. Her guidance was invaluable, but more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in our relationship. For the first time, Jessica was using her knowledge and experience to help me rather than inadvertently highlighting my shortcomings. We were becoming partners instead of competitors. The hardest conversation came when we had to discuss my relationship with our parents. Despite their apologies and newfound pride, there was still tension around my decision to keep my application secret for so long. They're struggling, Jessica observed after a particularly awkward family dinner where Mom and Dad seemed to be walking on eggshells around me. They know they messed up, but they don't know how to fix it. I don't know if it can be fixed, I said honestly. 20 years of being told you're not good enough, that doesn't just go away because you proved them wrong once. Maybe not, Jessica agreed. But you have a choice about what comes next. You can hold on to that hurt forever, or you can let this be the beginning of a different kind of relationship with them. She was right, of course. I could see my parents trying, in their clumsy way, to make amends. Dad had stopped making comparisons between us. Mom had actually asked to read some of my creative writing. They were learning to see me differently, and I had to decide whether I was willing to let them. What would you do? I asked Jessica. I'd give them a chance, she said without hesitation. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve to have parents who see you clearly. And I think they're starting to. As Christmas approached, I realized that Jessica was right about more than just our parents. I had choices to make about the kind of person I wanted to be going forward. I could remain the girl who'd been underestimated and dismissed, carrying that identity like armor against future disappointment, or I could become someone who'd proven that she was capable of extraordinary things and was ready to keep proving it. The Yale acceptance letter had given me power, the power to rewrite my family's story and my own. Now I had to decide what to do with that power. And Jessica was helping me understand that the most powerful thing I could do was use it with grace. Christmas that year was different from any holiday we'd had before. Instead of the usual dynamic where Jessica's achievements dominated conversation and I faded into the background, we found ourselves talking as equals, two young women figuring out their paths, supporting each other instead of competing. My parents, clearly still processing their misconceptions about me, made touching if slightly awkward attempts to make up for lost time. Dad gave me a leather-bound journal with future Yale graduate embossed on the cover. Mom framed my acceptance letter and hung it in the hallway, right next to Jessica's high school graduation photo. Symbolic gesture that spoke volumes about the shift in how they saw our family hierarchy. But the most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source. Grandma Elena pulled me aside after Christmas dinner and handed me a small box wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a gold locket that had belonged to her mother, my great-grandmother who had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but dreams of a better life for her children. She would be so proud, Grandma Elena said, tears in her eyes. You have her spirit, Mia. The courage to reach for something bigger than what everyone else thinks you deserve. Wearing that locket, I felt connected to a legacy of strength and determination that went far beyond test scores or family expectations. I was part of a story of women who refused to be limited by other people's narrow definitions of what they could achieve. As spring arrived and my high school graduation approached, I found myself in the strange position of being the family success story. Teachers who had barely noticed me before suddenly wanted to talk about my plans. Classmates who had dismissed me as unremarkable began asking for advice about college applications. The attention was gratifying, but it also highlighted how much I'd changed over the past year. The shy, uncertain girl who had hidden her dreams was gone, replaced by someone who could stand in front of the school board and give a speech about the importance of supporting students' individual strengths, instead of forcing them all into the same mold. Mrs. Patterson, who had become more than a teacher, she was my mentor and friend, pulled me aside after graduation practice. I have something for you, she said, handing me a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a first edition copy of The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. the book that had first made me understand the power of writing about your own experience in your own voice. This book changed my life when I was your age, she said. I want you to have it as you begin this new chapter. Remember that your voice matters, Emma. Don't let anyone, not even at Yale, convince you to make it smaller or more acceptable. The inscription she'd written on the title page read, "To Emma, who taught me that the most important thing we can do as educators is help students discover not who we think they should be, but who they already are." I cried reading those words, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years earlier, I'd been a struggling student convinced I had nothing special to offer. Now I was heading to Yale University, not despite who I was, but because of it. The weeks leading up to my departure for New Haven were filled with a strange mixture of excitement and melancholy. I was eager to start this new chapter of my life, but I was also saying goodbye to the version of myself who had lived in this house. In this family dynamic, for 20 years, Jessica and I spent countless hours talking about what lay ahead for both of us. True to her word, she had changed her major to psychology with a focus on art therapy, despite some initial resistance from our parents. Her courage in pursuing her own path had been inspired partly by watching me fight for mine, and I felt proud to have played a role in her journey toward authenticity. You know what's funny? She said one evening as we packed books into boxes for my move to Yale. For years, I thought being the perfect daughter meant I was helping our family. But I think I was actually hurting us by making everyone else feel like they had to live up to an impossible standard. You were just being yourself, I told her. The problem wasn't that you were good at school, it was that Mom and Dad couldn't. See that there are different ways to be good at things. Maybe, she said thoughtfully. But I'm glad we figured it out. I'm glad we found our way back to being sisters instead of just competitors for their approval. Our parents had come a long way in those months between Thanksgiving and my high school graduation. The awkward overcompensation had gradually given way to something more genuine, real curiosity about my interests, authentic pride in my achievements, and what seemed like a sincere commitment to doing better going forward. Dad had even started reading some of the books I recommended, trying to understand the literature that had shaped my perspective. I never realized how powerful words could be. He admitted one evening after finishing a novel by Toni Morrison that I'd loved in high school. I think I understand better now why you want to study this seriously. Mom had begun sharing my Yale acceptance story with anyone who would listen, but in a way that celebrated my unique path rather than treating it as a miraculous exception to my usual failures. Emma always saw the world differently, she'd tell people. We just didn't understand that was her strength, not her weakness. As August approached and my departure date grew near, I realized that the girl who had hidden her Yale application in secret was truly gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, who had learned to advocate for her dreams, and who was ready to take on one of the world's most challenging academic environments. The night before I left for Yale, I sat in my childhood bedroom one last time, surrounded by packed boxes and memories. Tomorrow, I would begin the next chapter of my story at a university I'd once thought was impossibly out of reach. But tonight, I was still Emma Rodriguez from this small house in this small town, carrying with me all the lessons I'd learned about courage, persistence, and the power of believing in yourself when no one else will. The acceptance letter that had started it all was carefully packed in my suitcase. Along with Mrs. Patterson's book and Grandma Elena's locket, these artifacts of my journey would come with me to New Haven, reminders of how far I traveled and how much I'd grown. Tomorrow, I would find out what Emma Rodriguez could accomplish when she was finally in a place that valued her unique gifts. But I already knew the most important thing. I was ready. My parents drove me to New Haven in August, the car packed with everything I thought I'd need for my new life. The campus was even more beautiful than I'd imagined, with its Gothic architecture and tree-lined courtyards that spoke of centuries, of learning and discovery. As we pulled through the gates and onto the historic campus, I felt like I was entering a world I'd only dreamed about. The move-in process was a blur of activity, meeting my roommate Sarah, a brilliant girl from Oregon who wanted to study environmental science, hauling boxes up 3 flights of stairs to my dorm room in Silliman College, attending orientation sessions that introduced me to resources I'd never known existed, But it was watching my parents take in the magnitude of what was happening that affected me most deeply. They walked around campus with expressions of wonder and pride that I'd never seen before. Dad kept stopping to read plaques and historical markers, clearly amazed that his daughter was now part of this centuries-old tradition of scholarship. "This is incredible, Emma," Mom whispered as we toured the library system. "All these books, all this knowledge, and you belong here." The word belong hit me like a physical force. For 20 years, I'd felt like I didn't quite belong anywhere not. In my family's vision of success, not in traditional academic settings, not in the future they'd imagined for me, but standing in that library, surrounded by more books than I could read in a lifetime, I felt something I never experienced before. The deep certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. As we unloaded my belongings in my dorm room, I could see my parents taking in the reality of what I'd accomplished. The Yale sweatshirt hanging in my closet, the course catalog on my desk, the ID card that identified me as a Yale undergraduate, these weren't just symbols of academic achievement. They were proof that their daughter had been capable of extraordinary things all along. "I'm proud of you," Dad said quietly as we sat at my desk. "And I'm sorry I didn't see this in you sooner." "You see it now," I replied. "That's what matters." Mom was trying not to cry as she made my bed with the sheets we bought together, Yale blue, naturally. "I keep thinking about all the times I told you to be more practical, to lower your expectations," she said. "I was trying to protect you from disappointment, but I was the one who was disappointing you." "Mom," I said, taking her hands. "You did your best with what you knew then. We all did. But now we know better and we can do better." That evening, after my parents had driven home and I was alone in my dorm room for the first time, I sat at my new desk and opened the journal Dad had given me for Christmas. On the first page, I wrote, "I am Emma Rodriguez. I am 20 years old. I am a Yale student. I am a writer. I am not my sister. And that is not a failure. It is my strength." This is the beginning of my story, written in my own voice, on my own terms. The first few weeks at Yale were both exhilarating and overwhelming. I was taking Introduction to Creative Writing with Professor Margaret Watts, a published novelist whose work I'd admired for years. The other students in the class came from prestigious prep schools and had been writing seriously since middle school, while I was the public school kid who'd hidden her dreams until senior year. But something remarkable happened in those early classes. When Professor Watts asked to write about overcoming obstacles, my piece about growing up as the family disappointment resonated with everyone in the room. When we discussed the power of voice in literature, my perspective shaped by years. A feeling unheard brought insights that even the most privileged students couldn't match. "Your writing has an authenticity that can't be taught," Professor Watts told me after class one day. "You write from a place of real experience, real struggle. That's rare and valuable." I started to understand what Yale had seen in my application. It wasn't despite my background that I belonged here, it was because of it. My struggles with family expectations, my late discovery of my own potential, my journey from hiding my dreams to pursuing them boldly. These experiences had given me a perspective that enriched the academic community. My first semester grades arrived in December. A in creative writing, A in literature of the Americas, B+ in introduction to psychology, A in first year seminar on identity and belonging. I stared at the transcript for a long time, remembering the girl who'd struggled to maintain a B average in high school. I called home to share the news, and the pride in my parents' voices was unmistakable. "We always knew you were smart," Mom said, though we both knew that wasn't quite true. "We just didn't know how to help you show it." "You're helping me show it now," I told her. "By believing in me, by being proud of who I actually am instead of who you thought I should be." Jessica was home for winter break when I returned, and she greeted me with a hug that lasted longer than usual. "You look different," she observed, confident. "Like you know exactly who you are." "I'm starting to," I admitted. "It turns out when you're in a place that values what you're good at, you get a lot better at being yourself." We spent that break talking about our respective journeys. Jessica had officially changed her major and was loving her psychology courses. despite some lingering concern from our parents about the practicality of art therapy as a career. But their experience with me had taught them to trust their daughters' instincts about their own paths. "You changed everything for our family," Jessica told me one evening as we walked around our old neighborhood, not just by getting into Yale, but by showing all of us that there are different ways to be successful, different ways to be smart. "You gave me permission to stop being perfect and start being real." When I returned to Yale for spring semester, I felt more confident than I had in the fall. I joined the staff of the Yale Literary Magazine, started attending readings by visiting authors, and even submitted a piece to a national undergraduate writing competition. The night I found out I'd won second place in that competition, I called Mrs. Patterson first. "I'm not surprised," she said, though I could hear the tears in her voice. "You were always meant for this, Emma. I'm just so grateful I got to be part of your journey." Then I called my family. The conversation was different from any we'd ever had. Instead of feeling like I was proving myself to them, I felt like I was sharing good news with people who already believed in me. "We're so proud of you," Dad said. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed he meant it. That spring, I was selected for a competitive summer writing program at Yale, one that would connect me with established authors and help me develop a manuscript for potential publication. As I read the acceptance email, I thought about the girl who'd hidden her Yale application in secret. Terrified that her dreams were too big to dodge, she had no idea what she was capable of. But now I did. By my sophomore year at Yale, the transformation in my family was complete and irreversible. What had started as shock and guilt over my hidden acceptance had evolved into something deeper, a fundamental shift in how we understood success, intelligence, and each other. The local newspaper had indeed run that feature story about my journey to Yale, and it had been picked up by several regional publications. The headline read, "Local Student Proves That Dreams Have No Expiration Date," and the article detailed my path from struggling high school student to Yale undergraduate. Reading it, I barely recognized the girl they described, someone who would have overcome obstacles through determination and self-belief. But more meaningful than the media attention was the change in everyday interactions with my community. Teachers at my old high school started using my story as an example for students who felt like they didn't fit traditional academic molds. Mrs. Patterson told me that several students had come to her saying they wanted to apply to reach schools because if Emma Rodriguez could get into Yale, maybe they could achieve their own seemingly impossible dreams. The bookstore where I'd worked during high school created a small display featuring books by Yale alumni, with a sign that read, "Inspired by our own Emma Rodriguez, Yale class of 2027. Mrs. Henderson had framed the newspaper article and hung it next to the register, telling customers about the young woman who used to shelve books in the back room and now studied literature at one of the world's most prestigious universities. At home, the changes were even more profound. Family dinners had become collaborative rather than competitive spaces. Instead of Jessica's achievements dominating conversation, while I faded into the background, we found ourselves discussing our different paths with equal enthusiasm and respect. "Tell us about your poetry workshop," Mom would say, genuinely interested in hearing about my latest assignment or the feedback I'd received from professors. When I shared excerpts from my work, she listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. Instead of immediately suggesting I focus on something more practical, Dad had surprised everyone by becoming genuinely interested in literature. He'd started reading the books I mentioned in our phone calls, and our conversations increasingly centered around ideas and themes rather than just grades and practical concerns. "I never realized how much thinking went into writing," he told me during one visit home. "I always thought it was just making things up, but there's real intellectual work involved." The shift in my parents' perspective had ripple effects throughout our extended family. Uncle Roberto, who had once suggested community college as my best option, now bragged to his friends about his niece at Yale. Grandma Elena kept my newspaper clipping in her purse and showed it to anyone who would look. The twins, now in high school themselves, started asking me for advice about college applications and pursuing their own interests. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with Jessica. Our dynamic had evolved from reluctant Siblings competing for parental approval to genuine friends supporting each other's authentic journeys. Jessica's decision to pursue art therapy had been met with some initial resistance from our parents, but my example had taught them to trust their daughter's instincts about their own paths. You paved the way for me to be honest about what I wanted, Jessica told me during one of our regular phone calls. Watching you fight for your dreams gave me permission to examine my own. She was thriving in her new major, working with professors who appreciated her unique combination of analytical thinking and creative intuition. Her GPA was still impressive, but more importantly, she seemed genuinely excited about her coursework for the first time since I'd known her. I used to study because I was supposed to, she explained. Now I study because I love what I'm learning. That's a completely different experience. The ripple effects of my Yale acceptance had even influenced her relationship with Marcus. Freed from the pressure to be the perfect couple that mirrored her academic achievements, they'd been able to develop a more authentic partnership based on mutual support rather than mutual accomplishment. Back at Yale, I was discovering new aspects of myself that had been dormant during my years of feeling like a disappointment. I joined the editorial board of the Yale Literary Magazine, where my perspective as someone who hadn't grown up in elite academic circles brought fresh insights to our publication decisions. You have an eye for authentic voices, the editor-in-chief told me after I championed a submission from a community college transfer student. You can spot the real thing because you are the real thing. I'd also started volunteering with a local literacy program, working with high school students who reminded me of my younger self, bright, creative young people who didn't fit traditional academic molds. Teaching them about the power of their own voices felt like completing a circle that had started with Mrs. Patterson's belief in me. One of my students, a 17-year-old named Maria who wrote beautiful poetry but struggled with standardized tests, reminded me so much of myself that I sometimes felt like I was looking into a mirror. I want to apply to good colleges, she told me one afternoon after a particularly productive writing session. But my counselor says I should be realistic about my options. What does realistic mean to you? I asked her. Community college, maybe state school if I'm lucky. Nothing like where you go. I thought about the girl I'd been at her age, convinced that dreams like Yale were for other people. People who fit a certain mold I'd never be able to match. Maria, I said carefully, 2 years ago my own family thought I should be realistic too. They thought Yale was impossible for someone like, but here's what I learned. The only person who gets to decide what's realistic for your life is you. The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful I'd had since arriving at Yale. I told her about my secret application, about the months of doubt and preparation, about the Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. By the end of our session, Maria was researching writing programs at universities I would never have dared to mention to her before. 3 months later, she was accepted to Columbia's undergraduate writing program with a full scholarship. When she called to tell me the news, I felt the same pride I imagined Mrs. Patterson had felt when I'd gotten into Yale. The circle was complete. I'd become for Maria what Mrs. Patterson had been for me, an adult who saw potential where others saw limitations, who encouraged dreams where others counseled realism. As my sophomore year at Yale drew to a close, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner revelation. The girl who had hidden her acceptance letter was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her unique perspective wasn't a liability to overcome, but a strength to celebrate. I was no longer the family disappointment trying to prove her worth. I was Emma Rodriguez, Yale student, published writer, and mentor to other young people who dared to dream beyond other people's expectations. And that transformation had changed not just me, but everyone around me who had learned to see intelligence and success in new and broader ways. The letter arrived during my junior year at Yale, handwritten on my father's work stationery in his careful engineer's script. I almost dismissed it as a routine update about family news, but something about the weight of the envelope and the formality of the return address made me pause. Inside was 3 pages of the most honest writing my father had ever shared with me. Dear Emma, it began. I've started this letter a dozen times over the past 2 years, never finding the right words to express what I need to say to you. But your mother reminded me that sometimes the inadequate words are better than the perfect. Silence. So here I am, finally trying to make amends for 20 years of getting it wrong. I sat in my dorm room reading as my father detailed, with painful honesty, his recognition of how his constant comparisons and low expectations had affected me. He wrote about the shame he felt when he realized that his disappointing daughter had been working towards something extraordinary while he'd been suggesting community college. He acknowledged that his question at Thanksgiving dinner, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" had been the culmination of years of failures to see who I actually was. "I measured your worth by Jessica's standards," he wrote, "instead of trying to understand what your own standards might be. I mistook different for deficient, and in doing so, I almost missed witnessing one of the most remarkable achievements anyone in our family has ever accomplished." The letter went on to describe his own journey of understanding over the past 2 years. He'd started reading books I'd recommended, not just to make conversation, but to genuinely understand the literary world that had shaped my perspective. He'd attended a reading by a Yale alumna at a local bookstore and found himself crying as she read an essay about overcoming family expectations. Sitting in that audience, he wrote, "I realized that I was listening to the kind of writer you might become, and I felt a mixture of pride and regret that was almost overwhelming. Pride because you had found your calling despite my failure to recognize it, and regret because I had wasted so many years not celebrating the gifts you'd shown me all along." But the most powerful part of the letter was his acknowledgement of how his treatment of me had affected not just our relationship, but our entire family dynamic. "I realize now that by constantly comparing you to Jessica, I wasn't being fair to either of you," he continued. "I was forcing Jessica to carry the burden of being perfect, and I was denying you the chance to be excellent in your own way. I created a competition where there should have been collaboration, and I robbed both my daughters of the chance to support each other's different but equally valuable paths." He ended the letter with a promise. "I know I can't undo 20 years of getting it wrong, but I want to spend the rest of my life getting it right. You don't owe me forgiveness, but I hope you'll give me the chance to be the father you deserve to have all along, one who sees you clearly and celebrates you authentically." I cried reading that letter, not just from sadness about the years of misunderstanding, but from relief that my father finally understood what I'd been trying to show him my entire life, that I was worthy of love and respect exactly as I was. When I called home that evening, Mom answered the phone. "Did you get Dad's letter?" she asked immediately. "I did," I said. "It was thank you, both of you, for finally seeing me." "Oh, sweetheart," Mom's voice was thick with emotion. "We've been seeing you all along. We just didn't know how to appreciate what we were seeing." Dad got on the extension, and for the first time in years, we had a conversation that felt completely honest and open. He asked about my classes, my writing, my plans for after graduation, and I could hear in his voice that he was genuinely interested in my answers rather than just making obligatory parental inquiries. "I've been thinking about something," he said toward the end of our call. "Would you be willing to come speak at my company's diversity and inclusion event? They're looking for speakers who can talk about overcoming obstacles and achieving goals that seemed impossible." The request was so unexpected that I was quiet for a moment. "You want me to speak at your work?" "I want my colleagues to meet my remarkable daughter," he said simply. "I want them to hear about your journey to Yale, about how you believed in yourself when no one else would. I think you have something important to say about persistence and self-advocacy." 6 months later, I stood in front of a room full of engineers and business professionals, telling the story of my secret Yale application and the Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. But I wasn't just sharing my achievement. I was talking about the importance of recognizing different types of intelligence, of supporting people's authentic paths rather than forcing them into predetermined molds. After my presentation, several people approached me with their own stories of feeling underestimated or misunderstood. A young engineer told me about his secret dream of writing fiction. A project manager shared that she'd always wanted to pursue art, but had been told it wasn't practical. Dad stood nearby, beaming with pride as his colleagues praised his daughter's insight and eloquence. "I never imagined I'd have a daughter who could command a room like that," he told me afterward. But then, again, I never imagined a lot of things about you that turned out to be true. The relationship between my parents and me continued to evolve throughout my remaining time at Yale. They started visiting campus, not just for major events, but for ordinary things, poetry readings I was participating in, literary magazine release, parties, casual dinners where they could meet my friends and professors. During one visit, Mom sat in on one of my creative writing workshops at Professor Watt's invitation. Afterward, she was quiet for a long time. "I had no idea," she said finally. "I had no idea how sophisticated your thinking was, how much intellectual work goes into what you do. I always thought writing was just, I don't know, making things up. A lot of people think that," I told her. "It's okay that you didn't understand before. What matters is that you're trying to understand now." Jessica often joined these family visits, and it became clear that our parents' growth and understanding me had also freed them to appreciate her more authentically. They stopped putting pressure on her to be the family's sole source of pride and started celebrating both daughters for their different but equally valuable contributions. "You saved our family," Jessica told me during one of these visits. "Not just by getting into Yale, but by forcing all of us to become more honest about who we really are." By my senior year, the dynamic had completely reversed from my childhood experience. Instead of feeling like I had to prove my worth to my family, I felt genuinely supported and celebrated by people who finally saw me clearly. The girl who had hidden her dreams was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own value and could advocate for herself with confidence. The apology my father had written was more than just words. It was the beginning of a new relationship built on mutual respect and genuine understanding, and that transformation had ripple effects that extended far beyond our family, influencing how I approached relationships, how I mentored other students, and how I understood my own responsibility to see people clearly rather than forcing them into narrow definitions of success. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the quiet moments when people who love you finally learn to love you for who you actually are. Senior year at Yale brought opportunities I could never have imagined when I was the struggling high school student hiding college brochures under my homework. I'd been selected for the prestigious Beckman Fellowship, which would fund a year of post-graduation writing and research. My senior thesis, a collection of essays about family, identity, and the courage to define yourself, had been nominated for the university's undergraduate writing prize, but perhaps most meaningfully, I'd been accepted to several graduate programs in creative writing, including Yale's own MFA program. The girl who had once been told to be realistic about her academic aspirations was now choosing between opportunities at some of the most respected writing programs in the country. The decision felt surreal every time I thought about it. Emma Rodriguez, former family disappointment, weighing offers from Columbia, Iowa, and Yale for graduate study. The teenage girl who had applied to Yale in secret could never have imagined that the university would want to keep her for an additional 3 years. I called Mrs. Patterson first when the Yale MFE acceptance arrived. "Oh, Emma," she said, and I could hear her crying through the phone. "To think that little seed we planted in my classroom has grown into this. You're going to be a Master of Fine Arts from Yale University. Because you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself," I reminded her. "None of this would have happened without you seeing something in my writing that I didn't even know was there." "I just recognized what was already there," she said. "You did all the hard work of nurturing it into something extraordinary." When I shared the news with my family, their reaction was everything the teenage Emma had dreamed of and more. Dad actually whooped with joy, something I'd never heard him do about any of my achievements. Mom immediately started planning how to tell everyone she knew. Jessica screamed so loudly that her roommates came running to make sure she was okay. 3 more years at Yale, Jessica said when we video called that evening. "Emma, do you realize what this means? You're not just succeeding at your dream school, you're excelling so much that they want to invest in your future as a writer." The conversation with my parents that followed was a perfect encapsulation of how far we'd all come. Instead of questioning whether graduate school was practical or suggesting I consider more stable career paths, they wanted to hear about my thesis, project, my plans for my fellowship year, and which professors I'd be working with in the MFA program. "Tell us about your writing," Dad said, settling in for what I knew would be a long conversation. "What are you working on for your thesis?" I explained that my collection explored themes of family expectations, cultural identity, and finding your voice when others have tried to define you. Several pieces drew directly from my own experience growing up as the disappointing daughter who discovered her worth through literature and writing. "One essay is actually about that Thanksgiving dinner," I told them, "about how revealing my Yale acceptance changed not just how you saw me, but how I saw myself." Mom was quiet for a moment. Am I going to come across badly in this essay?" "You come across as human," I said honestly. As parents who loved their daughters but didn't always know how to show it in ways that felt supportive. As people who learned and grew and ultimately created space for both Jessica and me to be authentic. "That sounds fair," Dad said. "And probably more generous than we deserved for a lot of those years. The essay isn't about blame," I continued. "It's about transformation. About how families can evolve when they're willing to examine their assumptions and grow beyond them." Jessica had been accepted to a competitive art therapy graduate program at Northwestern, building on her undergraduate psychology major with specialized training in using creative expression for healing. The synchronicity felt perfect both. Sisters pursuing graduate degrees in fields that combined our academic strengths with our authentic passions. "Remember when we used to compete for Mom and Dad's approval?" Jessica asked during one of our regular phone calls. "Now we're both doing exactly what we love, and they're equally proud of both of us. It's like we're living in an alternate universe from the one we grew up in." She was right. The family dynamic that had defined our childhood, Jessica, the achiever, Emma, the disappointment, parents playing favorites, had completely dissolved. In its place was something healthier. Two young women pursuing their authentic paths with genuine family support. The summer before my MFA program began, I was invited to give the keynote address at my high school graduation. Standing at the podium, where I'd once felt invisible, looking out at an audience that included my former teachers, classmates' families, and the current graduating class, I felt the full weight of how much had changed. 4 years ago, I sat where you're sitting now. I told the graduates. I was convinced I was the disappointment in my family, destined for a small life because that's what everyone expected from me. What I didn't understand then was that other people's expectations only have the power we give them. I talked about the secret Yale application, about the courage it takes to bet on yourself when no one else will, about the importance of recognizing that there are many different ways to be intelligent and successful. Some of you are valedictorians, I continued. Some of you struggled to maintain passing grades. Some of you have clear career plans, and some of you have no idea what comes next. All of those paths are valid. What matters is that you give yourself permission to discover what you're truly capable of, especially if it's something no one else sees coming. After the ceremony, several students approached me with their own stories of feeling underestimated or uncertain about their futures. I spent an hour talking with a young woman who reminded me of myself, bright and creative, but convinced she wasn't college material because her strengths didn't show up on standardized tests. Apply anyway, I told her. Apply to schools that seem too good for you. Apply to programs that excite you even if they seem unrealistic. The worst thing that can happen is they say no, but what if they say yes? What if you're exactly what they're looking for and you just don't know it yet? 6 months later, she was accepted to a competitive art program with a full scholarship. The circle continued to expand. Mrs. Patterson had believed in me. I had believed in Maria. Maria had gone on to mentor other students. And now this young woman would undoubtedly inspire someone else to reach beyond their perceived limitations. As I prepared to begin my MFA program that fall, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The girl who had hidden her Yale acceptance letter was completely gone, replaced by someone who understood that authenticity and persistence could overcome almost any obstacle. I was no longer fighting to prove my worth. I was using my voice to help others discover theirs. And that felt like the most important achievement of all. My dorm room for graduate school was in a different building, but I unpacked the same artifacts that had traveled with me since freshman year. Mrs. Patterson's first edition book, Grandma Elena's Locket, the original Yale acceptance letter that had started it all. These reminders of my journey would continue to ground me as I embarked on the next phase of becoming the writer and the person I was meant to be. 3 more years at Yale stretched ahead of me, full of workshops and seminars, readings, and conferences. The daily work of learning to craft sentences that could change people's lives the way literature had changed mine. But this time, I wasn't the uncertain freshman wondering if she belonged. I was Emma Rodriguez, MFA candidate ready to claim my place in the long tradition of writers who had found their voices within these walls. The best was yet to come. Looking back now, 4 years after that transformative Thanksgiving dinner, I can see that my Yale acceptance was just the beginning of a story much larger than I could have imagined. As I sit in my graduate student office at Yale working on my MFA thesis and preparing for a teaching fellowship, I'm struck by how completely my life has been transformed, not just by the opportunities Yale provided, but by the confidence that came from proving to myself that I was capable of extraordinary things. The girl who hid her acceptance letter in her backpack is gone, replaced by a woman who knows her own voice and isn't afraid to use it. My thesis collection, Becoming Visible, Essays on Family Identity and the Courage to Define Yourself, has been accepted for publication by a prestigious university press. The book deal was announced in Publishers Weekly, and seeing my name in print as a forthcoming author felt like the final validation of a journey that began with Mrs. Patterson, recognizing something special in my high school writing, but more than personal achievement, what matters most is how this story has rippled outward to affect others. The essay about my family's transformation has been republished in several anthologies about education and family dynamics. I regularly receive emails from students who read it and found the courage to pursue their own unrealistic dreams. Maria, the student I mentored during my undergraduate years, is now finishing her junior year at Columbia and has been accepted to graduate school in journalism. She's working on a documentary about first-generation college students who defied expectations. You showed me that the most important thing you can do is believe in yourself when no one else will. She told me when she called to share her news. The ripple effects have reached my family in ways I never anticipated. Jessica completed her master's in art therapy and now works with teenagers who struggle with anxiety and depression. She credits our family's journey and specifically watching me advocate for my authentic path with teaching her the importance of helping young people find their own voices. I see so many kids who are trying to be what their parents want instead of discovering who they actually are. She told me during a recent visit, "I always think about you applying to Yale in secret, about the courage it took to bet on yourself. That's what I try to help my clients find the courage to be authentic even when it's scary." My parents have become advocates for educational diversity in ways that still surprise me. Dad serves on the school board now, pushing for programs that recognize different types of intelligence and support students who don't fit traditional academic molds. Mom volunteers with a local literacy program, working with students who remind her of the daughter she almost failed to understand. "I talk about you all the time," Mom admitted during our last phone call. "Not because you went to Yale, though I'm still proud of that, but because you taught our whole family that there are many ways to be smart, many ways to be successful. I wish I'd known that when you were younger." "You know it now," I reminded her, "and you're using that knowledge to help other families avoid the mistakes we made. That's what matters." Mrs. Patterson retired last year, but not before establishing a scholarship fund for students who show promise in creative writing but don't fit traditional academic profiles. The Emma Rodriguez Scholarship for Authentic Voice provides financial support and mentorship for young writers who might otherwise give up on their dreams. At the ceremony announcing the scholarship, Mrs. Patterson said something that brought me to tears. "Emma Rodriguez taught me that our job as educators isn't to shape students into what we think they should be, but to help them discover what they already are. This scholarship will support students who have that same authentic voice, that same courage to pursue their truth even when others can't see it." The scholarship has already supported 3 students in its first year, including a young man who's Science fiction writing was dismissed as not serious literature by his previous teachers, and a girl whose poetry about her immigrant experience was considered too political for her conservative high school's literary magazine. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came last month when I was invited to speak at a conference about educational equity. The audience was filled with teachers, administrators, and policymakers who were trying to create more inclusive academic environments. The tragedy isn't that I was underestimated, I told them. The tragedy is how many other students are being underestimated right now, in classrooms and families across the country. How many young people are hiding their dreams because they've been told those dreams are unrealistic? How many authentic voices are being silenced because they don't fit narrow definitions of academic success? After my presentation, a middle school teacher approached me with tears in her eyes. "I have a student who reminds me so much of your story," she said. "She's brilliant but struggles with traditional assessments. Her writing is extraordinary, but she's convinced she's not smart because she can't memorize math formulas. What you said today, I'm going to find a way to help her see what I see." These conversations happen everywhere I go now. Parents who are learning to celebrate their children's authentic strengths instead of forcing them into predetermined molds. Teachers who are recognizing different types of intelligence in their classrooms. Students who are finding the courage to pursue paths that don't look like anyone else's definition of success. This is the real legacy of my Yale acceptance, not the personal achievement, but the way it has challenged everyone around me to expand their understanding of what's possible. The secret application that I was once so afraid to reveal has become a story of hope for anyone who has ever felt like their dreams were too big for other people's expectations. The lessons I've learned go far beyond academics or career success. I've discovered that the most important relationship you can have is with your authentic self, the person you are when you strip away other people's definitions and expectations. I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear. Most importantly, I've learned that your worth isn't determined by external validation, but by your commitment to honoring who you really are. As I look toward the future, toward finishing my MFA, toward launching my career as a published author, toward the possibility of teaching and mentoring the next generation of writers, I carry with me the artifacts that have shaped my journey. Mrs. Patterson's book sits on my desk as a reminder that teachers can change lives by believing in their students. Grandma Elena's locket hangs around my neck, connecting me to a legacy of women who refuse to be limited by circumstances. And yes, I still have that original Yale acceptance letter, though now it's framed in my office, rather than hidden in a backpack. These objects tell the story of a girl who learned to believe in herself when no one else would, who found the courage to pursue impossible dreams, and who discovered that the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be smaller than you are. My story isn't unique. There are countless young people out there who are underestimated, overlooked, or forced into boxes that don't fit their true shape. If this story reaches even one of them, if it helps one person find the courage to pursue their authentic path despite other people's limited expectations, then sharing it will have been worth it. Because here's what I learned. The people who love you are always the best at seeing you clearly, especially when their vision is clouded by fear or their own unfulfilled dreams. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to see yourself first, to believe in possibilities that others can't imagine, to take risks that feel impossible. That Yale acceptance letter wasn't just a mission to a university, it was proof that I had always been more than my family's narrow definition of success. It was validation that there are many ways to be intelligent, many paths to achievement, many ways to make a mark on the world. Most importantly, it taught me that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own truth. Whether it's parents who can't see past their own expectations, teachers who've written you off, or a society that has narrow definitions of success, you have the right and the responsibility to author your own story. I'm Emma Rodriguez. I'm 24 years old. I believed in myself when no one else would, and that made all the difference. Your story might be different from mine, but the principle remains the same. You are more than what others see, and you have the power to prove it not to them, but to yourself. The rest is just details and sometimes, if you're very lucky, those details include a Yale University diploma, a published book, and a family that finally sees you clearly. But even without those external markers of success, the most important victory remains the same: learning to honor your authentic self and having the courage to pursue your truth. No matter who believes in it, that courage changes everything, not just for you, but for everyone who witnesses it. When you refuse to accept limitations that others place on you, you give permission for others to do the same. When you pursue your authentic path despite skepticism and doubt, you create new possibilities for the people around you. My Yale acceptance didn't just transform my life, it transformed my entire family's understanding of success, intelligence, and love. Jessica found the freedom to pursue art therapy instead of traditional medicine. My parents learned to celebrate their daughters for who they actually are rather than who they thought we should be. Even my extended family began to recognize that there are many different ways to build a meaningful life, but the transformation extends far beyond our household. Every student I mentor, every person who reads my writing, every family that hears our story and decides to support their children's authentic dreams, they're all part of an expanding circle of possibility that began with one secret college application. The teenage girl who applied to Yale, in hiding, could never have imagined that her private act of rebellion would become a story of hope for so many others. She was just trying to survive in a family that didn't understand her, trying to prove to herself that she was more than their limited expectations. What she discovered is something I want every person reading this to understand. You are already enough exactly as you are. Your dreams are not too big. Your voice matters. Your unique perspective is not a flaw to overcome, but a strength to celebrate. The world needs what you have to offer, especially if it's something no one else sees coming. The most important stories, the most meaningful contributions, often come from people who refuse to accept the narrow rules others assign to them. So whether you're a struggling student who dreams of prestigious universities, a creative person in a family that values only traditional success, or anyone who has ever felt like their authentic self doesn't match other people's expectations, remember this: you have the right to author your own story. You don't need permission to dream big. You don't need validation to pursue what calls to you. You don't need others to believe in your potential before you act on it. All you need is the courage to take the first step, to submit that application, to speak your truth, to refuse to make yourself smaller for other people's comfort. The rest, the acceptances, the achievements, the transformation of relationships, those are just the beautiful details that follow when you finally decide to honor who you really are. I'm Emma Rodriguez, Yale graduate student, published author, and living proof that impossible dreams sometimes do come true. But more than any of those titles, I'm someone who learned that the most important acceptance letter you'll ever receive is the one you write to yourself, and that letter simply says, you are worthy of your dreams, exactly as you are. The end of this story is really just the beginning, because every time someone reads these words and finds the courage to pursue their own impossible dream, the story begins again. Every time a parent learns to celebrate their child's authentic gifts instead of forcing them into predetermined molds, the story continues. Every time someone refuses to be limited by other people's narrow expectations, they add a new chapter to this ongoing narrative of what becomes possible when we finally learn to see ourselves and each other clearly. Your chapter is waiting to be written. The only question is, are you ready to write it?